When was the last time you were hungry? No, I'm serious. When was the last time you were hungry? Most of us eat out of habit. We have a certain time set for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and so we try to observe those times as much as possible. Not because we're necessarily hungry, but because that's the time we're supposed to eat. How many of you have also, in a moment of boredom or unrest, got up from your chair, walked over to the refrigerator, and opened the door to see what was in there? Not that you wanted or needed anything at that moment, because as you looked in the refrigerator, you scanned the contents, and then you shut the door. It wasn't that you were hungry at all. It was just something to do. So when really was the last time you were hungry? Some years ago, my mother and my father visited Rosemary and I in Horseheads, and we had a late lunch. It wasn't 12 o'clock noon, it was like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And it wasn't too long before my father made his way into the kitchen. And he said to Rosemary, "When's dinner going to be on?" Now, when my father first met Rosemary, he said, "She's Italian, isn't she?" And I said, "Yes, I'll bet she has a temper." I said, "Absolutely, and don't you dare cross her." That's just to keep him in mind. But as he made his way into the kitchen, it wasn't even 5 o'clock yet, and he had just eaten at 2. "Is dinner going to be ready pretty soon?" And Rosemary said, "Myron, get out of my kitchen. You just had lunch. Dinner will be ready when dinner is ready." And you know, he beat it back to the living room. But think about that for a moment. When really was the last time you were hungry? I know that there are some medical conditions that mean we have to eat more often, or we have to pay attention to a regular regimen of eating. But for most of us, eating is more a habit than it is anything else. It's just a time we set aside to do the nourishment of the body. Well, I thought about that as I thought about the words that Jesus used in the Gospel of John when he said, "I am the bread of life." You know, in the church, we celebrate Holy Communion on the first Sunday of every month. And we generally, other than our camping ministry for this next week, have a table up here in our chancel area. So many people call it an altar. It is not an altar. It is a communion table, because Christ invites us to be at table with him. And you don't gather around an altar, you make sacrifices there. A table is a place where the people of God are invited to gather around to share a meal, to share fellowship. And that's exactly what Jesus had in mind when he spoke about himself and the work he had been sent into the world to do. "I am the bread of life." It's why we break a loaf. It's why we share bread, and it's why we share the cup as we celebrate God's gift to this world in Jesus Christ. But it's more than just a gift to the world. It's a gift to each one of us individually and personally. When Jesus said, "I am the bread of life," he was trying to communicate to us that his life and his ministry, his words, his teachings, the way in which he went about doing God's will was meant to impact and touch each one of us deep inside our souls. And that's what real life is about. We are not made for this world only, friends, and that's exactly what Jesus talked about himself as being the bread of life or the light of the world. Whatever image he tried to create, it was an image to remind us that we are created for a relationship which is greater than anything we have in our human existence. It is our relationship with our Creator, as we experience it through the love of God as we have seen it in Christ Jesus our Lord. Isn't it interesting that when Jesus went back to his hometown, he talked about this idea that I am the bread of life. And his neighbors and friends in the synagogue began to question, well, who is this who could say that? He's basically somebody we've known since his infancy. We know his mom and his dad. We know his brothers and his sisters. We know who this is. Where is he get the audacity to talk about himself as the bread of life? We've seen him running the streets of Nazareth. We've seen him as he helps his dad do a task here and there. We know about this person. And yet he has the nerve to come back to this community and say, I am the bread of life. Who is this person? The question Jesus would ask us is not so much when was the last time you were hungry. Jesus would ask us, when was the last time your soul needed nourishment? And what did you do about it? You can't go to the refrigerator, and you can't go at 5 o'clock or 12 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning. That's just not the way it works. So what do we do when our souls are hungry and thirsty? Where do we turn? And there's not a single person in this world at some point who hasn't had a yearning of the soul. And we know it because it creates a sense of emptiness in it when it isn't filled, when it isn't addressed, when somehow there's not something that fills that void and that space in our lives. Now, I remember feeling that way, and I shared this with you before when I was in high school. I had what most of the theologians and psychologists would call an existential emptiness. That is, I had no sense of what my purpose in life was. I knew I was going to graduate from high school, but I had no idea what the future might hold, and I simply felt a sense of emptiness. You know, you pour yourself into reaching an objective or a goal in your life, like graduation from high school or college or retirement, or all of those goals that we have that mark our human existence, as well as 8 o'clock, 12 o'clock, and 5 o'clock. We have those hallmarks in our lives. And then when we meet them, what's next? And often that's the time when the sense of emptiness, this void, sort of overwhelms us. And we're left wondering, what will happen now? Fortunately for me, there was a pastor who proclaimed the love and the grace of Jesus Christ. And suddenly, the void was gone. And I knew with a certainty that no matter what the future held, Christ was with me. And so when he says to these people gathered in his hometown, I am the bread of life, he's not talking about where's your next meal coming from, even though he had compassion and concern for that. And the early church was very concerned about nourishing people physically as well as spiritually. But when he said, I am the bread of life, he was talking about feeding one's soul. His words are intended for that purpose. His life and his ministry was a living example of how that happens as you reach out and as you share the good news of Jesus Christ with one another. If it hadn't been for a pastor, for example, I don't know when I would have been embraced with a purpose, a sense of future. I may have been left wandering and wondering for who knows how long. My friends, that's why we gather here. That's why we celebrate the good news of Jesus Christ, because God has a purpose for every single life. And when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, it's a reminder to us that we need to be open to the leading of the Spirit of the living God so that our lives can begin to reflect what God has placed in there. That it can take nourishment and become real and somehow express itself in the world around us. You know, I do believe that there's a soul in every one of us. It simply needs attention. And especially in those times when we feel that sense of unease, uncertainty, when we feel emptiness. You know, there's a lot of folks around who talk about being fed. And Jesus even uses that analogy for us because he's the good shepherd. And who are we? We are the sheep of his fold. And he feeds us and nourishes us and keeps us going, gives us the strength and the courage, and yes, even the audacity. You have no idea how Jesus felt when he went back to Nazareth. I mean, I went back to my hometown one time after I graduated from high school and I was in college, and I thought, wouldn't it be great to get reacquainted with all these folks? Do you know I didn't find one? They were all gone in their own direction. Whatever that was, I never knew. And the last time I went back was at my 50-year reunion. And they hardly even knew me. They didn't want to know about my family, things that happened in my life. They were all talking about how as teenagers they used to gather out at the pond and drink beer and smoke cigarettes. Where is the purpose? Where is the bread of life? And how do we ingest it so that we become the fullness that God intends us to be? When I say, what's for dinner, I'm not talking about your favorite meal. I'm talking about how do you nourish your soul. Here is nourishment for the soul. As we're gathered here this morning together, here is nourishment for the soul. When we sing these hymns, there is nourishment for the soul. There are so many ways in which God is trying to speak a word to us to reassure us that the words of Christ are eternal and they are meant for you and for me each and every day. I am the bread of life. The bread which you eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as Jesus said, that too goes away. But the one thing that is eternal is the nourishment that comes from the love of God in Jesus Christ our Lord. So what's for dinner? When is the last time? When is the last time you stopped long enough to nurture the soul? What's for dinner? Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I gave my life that you and I might have life in all its fullness. Don't underestimate the need to feed your soul, because that will determine almost everything else. Feed your soul with the love of God as you see it and experience it in Jesus Christ.